Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center AASHTO Bike Guide Series webinar. Today's webinar is titled Maintenance and Operations, and we will be speaking with Tom Huber, Senior Planner at Tool Design Group, and Michael Hintz, a Senior Planner also at Tool Design Group. Peter Lagerway will not be able to join us today. My name is James Gallagher, and I am the PBIC's Communications Manager. I will be facilitating today's webinar. Now I would like to welcome and thank Tom and Michael for their presentations today. We'll take questions at the end. Michael, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, James. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today. As James mentioned, this is the 7th and last webinar of a series of webinars on the new AASHTO Guide for the Development of Bicycle Facilities. Today's webinar will cover recommended maintenance programs and activities and bikeways in work zones. Because the guide dedicates about 7 pages to this topic compared to other chapters, today's webinar will likely be a bit shorter than the other webinars. So we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions, but you may be let out early today, so hopefully you're happy about that. Also, just want to remind everybody that you can follow us on Twitter and follow this conversation that we're having today on Twitter. And questions and answers to those questions will be logged on Twitter, so you can refer to them after the presentation as well. As James mentioned, there is a 20% discount for attendees of these webinars purchasing the new AASHTO guide. So he will provide details on that in a follow-up email. You don't have to write this URL down. Just some background, and I'll keep this brief. As I imagine a number of you have tuned into some of the other webinars and got a fair amount of background. But just a few points to make. AASHTO is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, and their mission is to provide technical services to support states in their efforts to efficiently and safely move people and goods. The AASHTO Bike Guide, the last version, was released in 1999. A lot has changed in the world of bicycle facility planning and design. And so this update was initiated in 2004 with a survey and finalized and published this past June 2012. Just a reminder that the AASHTO Bike Guide are just that, they're guidelines. They use should versus shall language. So they are just guidance, not standards. That said, a lot of agencies do choose to adopt these guidelines as their standards. One of the significant changes made in this 2012 4th edition is the chapter on maintenance and operations. While it is still slim, it has been expanded from a mere 1 page to 7 pages and covers the components of maintenance programs as well as maintaining accessibility for bicyclists through and around work zones. Now, the relationship to other manuals, the MUTCD, Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, provides guidance and standards on signs, signals, and pavement markings. And much of this, as they relate to bicycle facilities, is incorporated into the 2012 AASHTO Bike Guide. So they are compatible with each other. AASHTO Guide does elaborate on a number of design treatments. And AASHTO does not get out in front of the MUTCD on signs, signals, and pavement markings. For that reason, there are some new treatments that have not yet been approved by FHWA that aren't in the guide. And the PROWAG guide is worth mentioning. It does apply to shared use pathways, and Tom will be talking about the proper maintenance of shared use pathways, which is critical to maintaining accessibility. And lastly, the Highway Capacity Manual is another valuable resource. Pavement quality, maintaining pavement quality, is certainly a factor that's used in determining level of service, which the Highway Capacity Manual is concerned with. There's a lot of interest in the NACTO guide, the National Association of City Transportation Officials Urban Bikeway Design Guide. And I think the main point to make here, it's been made before on previous webinars, is that it's not an either-or situation between NACTO and AASHTO. The AASHTO guide is a comprehensive manual, and it covers all aspects of bicycle planning and design for both on-road and off-road bikeways, including the fundamental operating characteristics of bicyclists and geometric design, and also maintenance and operations, which is not covered in the NACTO guide. I do want to point out that the NACTO guide has some really valuable information on colored pavement markings and includes some maintenance considerations with the different types of materials that can be used for colored pavement. So I encourage all of you to check that out. Some really great information in there. They're always adding new information and feedback from cities that are experimenting with various materials for colored bike facilities. Now, as was mentioned, this is the 7th and last webinar in a series of 7. And the previous webinars will be available. Some of them, I think, already are available on the PBIC website, so you can tune into any of those. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and he's going to walk us through the components of a maintenance program. Tom, let me turn it over to you.
Okay.
Second. Okay, Tom.
Okay. Okay, can everyone see my or Michael and James, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Very good. So first off, happy Election Day to everyone. We'll be discussing two things today, maintenance in work zones. As Michael indicated, I'll cover maintenance and he'll cover work zones. There's just 7 pages, which is a big improvement over the last guide, but we'll probably only have about 15 or 20 minutes of presentation and then plenty of time for questions and answers. So the major maintenance components are listed here. They include sweeping, snow clearance, surface repairs, traffic signal detectors, signs and markings, a few other things as well that I'll go into. Maintenance is not really considered a very glamorous activity. There's no ribbon cuttings, but it's still essential work. Just as the workers are doing here, maintaining a shoulder probably won't win any awards. This path happens to be very close to where I live. They were working on it yesterday. And I can guarantee you that our council person probably received far more emails of concern about what was going on the path and probably didn't get very many compliments on the work that was being done. That's just the nature of maintenance. But it's essential for maintaining a good bicycle level of service and for a hedge against civil liability, i.e. lawsuits. In addition, Federal Highways requires that all facilities at funds be maintained. There are many state laws and ordinances as well that require maintenance. Sometimes it's maintenance of the highway, but that will include if there's a side path, certainly if there's paved shoulders or bike lanes. So these are the components in a little bit more detail. They include sweeping, surface repairs, pavement overlays, vegetation, signal detectors, signs and markings. This is just the first set. I'll go into slide number 2 in a second. But I should note that maintenance covers all facilities, not just bikeways. But the guide does call out bikeways specifically, and I think a reason why it does that is that streets and roadways are already being maintained as part of the highway, and often bikeways are not. These are the last 2 components of a maintenance program, including utility cuts and snow clearance. More and more communities are keeping paths open year-round. That means snow removal in those snow belt states for the bike lanes and the paved shoulders and the paths. Again, this is essential work, but the street departments don't get awards for maintaining facilities through the winter. They probably receive far more complaints than they do compliments. So let's go through each one of these components, starting with sweeping. I should note that sweeping is sometimes necessary for light and dry snowfalls as well. But typically it's because debris builds up in the bikeway, or sand and salt is certainly a menace. Sand and salt is really kind of a love-hate ordeal for maintenance workers. It's necessary to cut through the ice, but it turns into a problem in the spring when it needs to be collected and removed from a path or the shoulders or bike lanes. Silt is another problem. It happens where there is poor drainage, and wet silt is especially slippery. I think it's just about as slippery as ice is. Regarding fallen vegetation, you know, falls in a fall, leaves falling on a path can produce a really nice photo, but again, they are very slippery when they're wet and they need to be swept off of a path. So here are the solutions. You can establish a regular sweeping program, and the AASHTO guide recommends that. Along with that, you should have a reporting system in place as well. And the less regular your sweeping program is, the better that reporting system should be. The AASHTO guide does distinguish between curb and shoulder sweeping. If you're doing curb sweeping, you'll need a street sweeper to collect the material. If you're doing shoulder sweeping, it's mostly sweeping to brush off the gravel that has come on a path or a set of paved shoulders. You can probably just do that with a brush, a mechanical brush as shown here behind this, in front of this tractor. The guide does recommend a couple things to go beyond sweeping, like paving the entire shoulder, paving the driveway approach if it's gravel. I had worked at Wisconsin DOT for almost 20 years, and I know that our maintenance people were really very supportive of paving the entire gravel shoulder, and their take on it was this. They wanted to reduce the amount of shaping up of the gravel shoulder, bringing it back flush with the paved shoulder, and if the paved shoulder covered the entire shoulder, they wouldn't have to do that. So they were supportive of paved shoulders, entire width paved shoulders, to ensure that they could reduce their maintenance costs as well. And lastly, the guide does talk about the need to perhaps pass an ordinance that would require wreckers that haul away the remains of crashes to clean up after the crash itself so that there's a lessened amount of debris. So moving on to surface problems, these problems are likely to present some of the most serious hazards for bicyclists. Again, these problems do extend beyond bikeways and include paved shoulders and also the travel lanes. The longitudinal cracks, for example, may present a very serious problem to a bicyclist, but not to motorists in roadways or in bike lanes. So the main surface problems include cracks and potholes and bumps. Often the pavement just deteriorates over time. That will eventually happen. So the surface repairs start with inspection and reporting system and often end with patching and grinding and often just spot pavement replacement. And it's if you're starting up an inspection and reporting system, it's very critical to be emphatic about the importance of that system. That goes hand in hand with any maintenance program. If you use good construction standards, you can avoid or significantly delay the onset of problems as well. Design has a place as well. It can really reduce the impact, the cost of maintenance in the future. For instance, if you design a roadway and keep that joint out of the bike lane, there will be far fewer reported problems in the future. So here are some of the examples of repair solutions. Path grinding on this path in Denver, concrete path. Here's just a spots resurfacing example in Madison. You'll have these problems with longitudinal joints. This happens to be almost an inch wide. You would think that this would be a problem for bicyclists, and it is, but it's probably a more serious problem for inline skaters on shared use paths. The unusual thing about this particular joint, this crack, was that this was taken in March. When I went back in April, it had completely come back together after the frost had come out of the ground. So moving on to simple pavement deterioration, this tends to be a significant problem, and it's also an opportunity to use a higher performing repair. Overlays provide this excellent opportunity, but keep these tips in mind. You need to extend the overlay over the entire bikeway. You need to correct the edge drop-offs and joint problems. You need to pave the driveway approaches if they're in gravel. You need that smooth transition between the grates and the surface itself. And this is, again, an opportunity to use the best markings that you can afford at the time. So vegetation encroachments seem minor, but they can present serious hazards. Vegetation is often a problem that impacts bicyclists on shared use paths. Maintaining authorities are typically pretty good at keeping vegetation under control on highways themselves. So the growth comes from both sides and above, but it also can come from underneath the pavement itself. And the solutions are just simply to cut back on the vegetation or require adjacent landowners to cut vegetation back. You know, one of the problems impacting some areas is their inability, the authorities' inability to trim vegetation if the source is from private property. So you may have to give the authorities legal ability to trim the vegetation, as suggested by the guide. Signals also require maintenance. Typically, jurisdictions are responsive to any reported problems, usually within a day or two. Traffic signal detectors, those loop detectors are another case. Here are some possible solutions. You can adjust the sensitivity, place a stencil over the hotspot. This is more of an operations issue, but often you'll have to adjust the signal timing for bicycle clearance. Seems to be more of a software issue, but it certainly falls under the category of maintenance. There's also just general signal maintenance, and again, this is where your report a problem programs come into play. And if you have a program like that, it's important to have a quick turnaround time. Again, a day to 2 days for signal maintenance is often expected. Signs and markings also require maintenance, and here are some of the solutions. But first, inspection, including testing for retroreflectivity, is necessary. And then the solution is, of course, replacing signs and marking and signs and marking, and doing that in a routine fashion. For markings, those crosswalks and long lines, when overlays are done or a street is reconstructed, use the best marking material that you can. Markings will often be covered by the project funds, and often that constitutes just a very small part of the project. And on the other hand, maintenance budgets are very tight and often are being reduced in the amount of money that's available. So try to get the longest lasting marking material when you have a reconstruction project or when you have a resurfacing project. On to chip seal solutions here. Chip seal problems have seemed to increase over the past 10 years. Larger and sharper aggregate is being used. So the AASHTO guide says use a fine mix, maximum of a 3/8 inch aggregate. Where possible, do not chip seal the bike lanes or paved shoulders unless it's necessary. And then try to sweep the material off to the shoulder as soon as possible. And then when you do have that loose gravel, make sure that you warn users of that. And last and not least is snow and ice problems and maintaining paths and other bikeways for year-round use. First off, the snow that remains usually it's just the snow that remains or ice that remains for more than a couple of days. For example, it was snowing earlier today in Madison. No one was out there rushing to remove the snow and ice because it was melting right away. The problem is with the snow and ice that hardens and becomes a safety hazard, or it just impedes the movement of bicyclists and pedestrians. So the solutions are to remove the snow and ice, and often you'll have to use salt and gravel or salt and sand to help and to reduce and to remove that ice. Parking restrictions often have to be put in place so that you can plow right up next to the curb when you have bike lanes that are next to parking lanes. And you need to have that reporting system in place so that you can respond to problems and hazards that crop up. So that's it. I'll turn it back over to Michael, who will talk about work zones. Okay. Michael, you should have it.
Thank you, Tom. So Operating bikeways in work zones. This is a part of the guide that has been significantly beefed up, and it does cite some support that's in the MUTCD, which has strong language on keeping roadways open and accessible for bicyclists during construction. It's Part 6 of the MUTCD, Temporary Traffic Control. So it basically states that bicyclists should be treated the same as motorists for work zone accommodations, and treatments should be designed to accommodate bicyclists. Now, treatments may include temporary lane restrictions, temporary facilities such as paved surfaces, structures, signs, signals. May also include detours in certain cases. So operating bikeways in work zones needs to be part of a traffic maintenance plan. That's part of the construction plan for the project. And in some cases, particularly in large construction areas where you may have flaggers or pilot cars, the workers need to be trained so that they are understanding of the slower speeds of bicyclists. And I'll get into that in the next slide here. The short of it is MUTCD and AASHTO guide state that accommodation within work zones is preferred over detouring around work zones. And the idea behind that is that bicyclists should be able to proceed as close to the normal route as practical. They're going to do it anyway, and it's just not, they're not going to go out of indirection, or out of direction rather. And so that kind of treatment is just not going to work in a lot of cases. So the idea is to accommodate within the work zone as much as practical. Now the guide does kind of break up work zones into rural highways and urban streets and suggests different kinds of treatments. For a rural highway, treatments depend on the volume and length of the work zone. So if it's a large, many miles, you might provide room for vehicles to pass. So this often can be done with a paved shoulder if that exists. But for shorter or lower volume roadways, you can probably just accommodate bicyclists in lane or use standard traffic control practices in that situation. For urban areas where there's a lot more destinations closer together, significant indirection is just not going to work. As I stated earlier, people are going to want to get to their destinations, and they're going to want the most direct route. So often we'll have to provide a designed accommodation for bicyclists to either cross the work zone or to allow travel within the work zone. And many bicyclists are willing to share the lane with motor vehicles for short distances through work zones. That photo to the right there shows a street in Seattle, Washington, where bicyclists there was a lot of signage put out indicating that bicyclists are going to be sharing the car lane. And then the other thing is, if a closure has to happen where bicyclists are it's just not safe for them to travel within the work zone, then it should be within a short period of time. And in a lot of cases, judgment comes into play, and really understanding the favored routes and destinations of bicyclists is key to kind of figuring out the best treatment for accommodating them in and through work zones. As far as detours go, I mean, as stated, this detour should really only be considered where there's just no way to accommodate the bicyclist in the roadway, either due to high traffic volumes and speeds, or where construction just restricts the width of the roadway to such a degree that there's just no way to safely allow bicyclists through the area. So detours, the guide does include a few points about detours. One is that detours shouldn't require bicyclists to make more than one left turn across heavy traffic. So it shouldn't be a zigzag type detour. And where this may occur, it suggests that separate detour routes for each direction of travel should be considered. And another key aspect is providing advanced warning. So just as you would for motor vehicles, provide signage that allows them to choose an alternative route well ahead, well before the actual construction zone. The same goes for bicyclists. I've included a couple photographs here from Seattle. There's a street here where they are installing a streetcar, and it's really not a safe place for bicyclists to ride in the street because there's tracks. There's just not the appropriate signage has not been put up to warn cyclists about the newly installed track. So they're really encouraging bikes to stay off that roadway, and they have put up a lot of signage within several blocks of the corridor that tells bicyclists to choose an alternative route. In this case, it's 12th Avenue. And in some cases that works. Even along this corridor, the land uses are such that, and the street network is such that alternatives are there and available. There are a couple spot locations where the street network is a bit more sparse, and you see a lot of bicyclists traveling through the work zone. There have been several reported cases of crashes involving bicyclists in the newly installed track. So it's one of those context-specific things, and I think the main takeaways are that you can't expect bicyclists to go far out of direction, so some accommodation has to be made. And just a couple things. Again, Part 6 of the MUTCD contains more mode-specific detour guidelines, and that one sign on the left hand is the M49C, it's the bicycle detour sign, which should be used in the case of providing detours. And I think that's all I'm going to say on bikeways and work zones, and I think it's a good time to open it up to questions for presenters or for the listeners out there. And we have, as was stated, we have lots of time for questions. So, James?
Thank you very much. Yes, we do have plenty of time for questions, and I have received plenty of questions so far. So we will get started with those. The first question is, we tried long-lasting thermoplastic markings for a path crossing, but we got complaints that it was slippery. Now our street superintendent is dubious about that. What are your thoughts?
Well, it is true that some of the thermoplastics have gotten to be slippery after time, and that's because they get polished and they lose their slip resistance. So when they're first applied, they're okay, and then after some time, some thermoplastics lose their grip. But the thermoplastics are getting better, and I think it's just a matter of making sure that you work closely with your vendor to make sure that you get the specs right, and also that you research and make sure that you're getting good thermoplastics or good epoxies or whatever material that you're using. Michael, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I could just add a couple things, and we have been doing some research and putting together a maintenance guide for FHWA and talked to a number of agencies around the country, and one of the discussion points was the use of thermoplastics and this specific question, their slipperiness. And from our findings, from our discussions with these agencies, it seemed like it really had a lot to do. I mean, the materials themselves, they have anti-slip granules in them, and it seems to be more of a matter of when they're installed, the conditions in which they're installed, that dictates how slippery they may be. And then I think another point was made in high traffic areas, and maybe you just stated this, Tom, but in high traffic areas where there's thermoplastic, they tend to get worn down and polished and are a little more slippery. So those areas should be paid attention to, and thermoplastic should be replaced if it is presenting.
Yeah, I think you should continue to work with your street superintendent and try to convince him or her that it's still a good idea. Thermoplastics last a lot longer than paint. You'll have to be back a couple times with paint. With thermoplastics and with epoxies, they can last several years. So you do have this this kind of built-in longevity to those materials.
Okay, thank you. The next question. I'm convinced we need to get our city of 25,000 more serious about maintenance. Any suggestions on first steps?
Well, first, it's a good idea to encourage the powers that be within any community to get serious about maintenance. So hats off to the person who posed this question. I think the first step is probably to sit down with your public works director, maybe the streets person, and go through the reasons why it's just a good idea to maintain bikeways. And then it might be a good idea to continue that conversation and talk a little bit about the criteria that that you want to use to determine what kind of problems and what the extent of the problems are. So you're not responding to perhaps every problem out there, but the more serious problems, or that maybe you can put some of the minor problems on hold until you have a resurfacing project. But it's good to establish that criteria. And then I guess lastly, I think putting together a reporting system so that the users, the citizens that are experiencing a problem can report the problems, the specific problems that exist out there. And then lastly, if you're a bicycle and pedestrian coordinator, I don't think this is a good job for you. I think it's a job for the appropriate people in City Hall or the county, and that's the streets people or the parks people or a combination of those two. Don't try to take this on yourself as the bicycle and pedestrian coordinator.
Thank you. The next question. I'm tired of our facilities being marginalized by poor maintenance. Don't all facilities, including bicycle and pedestrian facilities, have to be maintained?
Michael, I'll take this first, and if you've got anything to add, feel free to contribute. Well, I think it depends. I think the first step is to check the state statutes and the local ordinances, and to make sure that that there is support for maintenance, and again, often it comes down to the state statutes claiming that highways have to be maintained. So check with your state statutes and the local ordinances first, and that might be a good place to get the support you need.
Yeah, and I might just add to that in terms of shared use pathways. You know, they are the PROWAG applies to those, which is the accessibility guidelines for public right-of-way. So where those exist in the public right-of-way, they should be maintained to maintain accessibility for those with disabilities.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Our council decided 3 years ago to start snow removal on bikeways. Our city streets department does a decent job taking care of snow removal on paths, but 2 bike lanes that are located next to parked autos are always a problem. Tom mentioned something about this. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I didn't go into a lot of detail in the presentation, but this seems to be the biggest issue with bike lanes and winter maintenance of bike lanes. Typically, it's easier to take care of the snow removal on bike lanes that are next to a curb and gutter section. But when you have bike lanes that are next to a parking lane and people are parking their vehicles there 24/7, there are 2 issues. First, the plows have a really difficult time getting close to the vehicles. And then secondly, the vehicles, the people are parking their vehicles a couple feet away from the curb and gutter section so that their passengers can open the car doors. So you do have this case of a disappearing bike lane, in which case during many weeks during the winter, bicyclists will need to take the lane because the bike lane has disappeared. Now, one of the solutions is to just have a parking prohibition there, maybe for 2 hours or half a day a week, so you can get those parked cars out of there. You can move in your snow removal equipment right against the curb and gutter section, remove the snow that's mounted up there. Motorists will be able to park a little bit closer to the edge of the roadway or the curb and gutter. However, they're probably still going to be parked a little bit away from the snow that has mounted up there, simply so their passengers can get out. So it's not there's not a really good solution to that, but there are ways you can make it a little bit better.
Thank you. How can we get our county to sweep the paved shoulders?
I think the best way is probably to get your users to report the problems. If you've got a reluctant county or a state DOT, if you can get if the users are constantly calling and reporting a problem, the maintaining jurisdiction has to respond to that. Paved shoulders are often considered part of the highway by DOTs. The problem is that the paved shoulders accumulate the debris, the road debris, often the gravel that comes up from the gravel part of the shoulder, whereas the travel lanes and maybe even a couple feet of the paved shoulders are typically swept by the action of the vehicles, but then the debris collects 3-4 feet out onto the paved shoulder. So if there are problems, often have your users report the problems, and sometimes that will be the trick in getting your maintaining authority out there, because they have to maintain the entire roadway, not just the travel lanes.
All right. Does the guide offer any priorities on what are the main hazards?
The guide doesn't do that, but I'll kind of take a stab at that. And Michael, if you want to contribute, feel free to do so. I think geography plays a role in this. For example, if you're a coastal community, one of the main hazards is probably that sand that keeps coming across onto the path. If you're in one of the snow belt communities, you probably have snow and ice that's building up on paths, and that seems to be your biggest hazard. Whether you're in Hawaii or if you're in Alaska or Louisiana, vegetation can always cause a problem, and it can cause a serious sightline problem. But I would say that typically, and maybe universally, the surface problems are the most serious ones, and those are, the potholes, the you know, the missing segments of asphalt, the heaved up sections of pavement that because of vegetation growth is pushing through and causing pop-ups to occur on a path. Those tend to probably be the most serious, but the guide itself doesn't offer any priorities.
Okay. If a detour is required, what is considered a reasonable distance or detour length from the path?
I'll take that one, Tom.
Okay.
That's an excellent question. Excellent question, and I think it really depends a lot on the context. Are you in an urban environment, a rural environment? You know, where you have a lot of destinations, and you more than likely also have a pretty good street network. But most bicyclists are not going to want to, you know, it's hard to say a specific distance, but just from observations and from my own experiences, I'm not going to go, you know, more than 2 blocks out of my way to get to a destination. And more than likely, I'm probably not going to go out of my way at all. I'm going to find my way through the work zone. If cars can get through there, I can get through there. That said, you know, I think, again, it gets back to the user as well. I mean, if it's somebody who is sort of taking a through trip through an area, they may be more willing to go slightly longer distance out of their way because they are just passing through. But if they're trying to access local destinations, I think there's going to be less willingness to go out of direction. So there's no clean-cut answer, unfortunately, but I think those are the factors that should be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I think context is really important. The guide, I think, appropriately breaks things into the urban and rural. If you're out in Montana someplace and you know that there's road construction for 25 miles and there may not be any other options that you have, so a detour is not even possible. And I know that if there is a detour option and it's a 25-mile-long work zone, and you only have to detour 1 mile to get to an alternate route, 1 mile over a 25-mile route is not that much of a detour, whereas if you're in an urban area and your whole trip is only 1.5 miles long and you've got a 2-block detour, there's a good chance that you're not going to detour 2 or 3 blocks with a trip that's only 1 mile or 1.5 miles long. So context does play a big role in this, and I think that's one reason why the AASHTO guide wants you to think in terms of, is this an urban type of urban project or is this a rural project?
Are there any treatments for accommodating bicyclists in work zones that are not discussed in the guide?
Yeah. Well, the guide doesn't go into a lot of detail in terms of the types of treatments, sort of touches on those lightly and refers to the MUTCD as far as signage and markings go. One thing I think is a big consideration in work zones are, and not all cities use these, but in a lot of places they use steel plates in the roadway to cover up, you know, trenches that are under construction, and in a lot of cases these steel plates are extremely slippery when they're wet. And I've noticed, at least here in Seattle, that they're starting to use steel plates that have kind of a coarse paint on them that really improve traction, and they're no longer slippery. So that's one treatment that is not in the guide that I think is worth considering. Tom, you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I just think that the whole chapter on maintenance and operations in the guide is work in progress, and there's going to be probably double the number of pages and content in the next guide on maintenance and operations. So between now and then, there's going to be a lot of good ideas out there, like Michael just indicated, where it just makes sense to kind of incorporate some of these ideas into a project, and often they're consistent with the other maintenance practices that are occurring on other parts of projects, on the highway part of a project, for example. So they're not they may even be proven, but they're just not in the guide yet. So if they're kind of a proven technique used elsewhere, good results, they just make sense to incorporate. I would say go ahead and use that technique, use those methods, and make note of that for the next issue of the guide.
All right, thank you. A county in Washington State claims they cannot pave shoulders because it would increase stormwater runoff. This adversely impacts bicycling. Do you have recommendations on how to deal with this county's position? Are other jurisdictions also taking this position on shoulders and stormwater?
That is an excellent question, and I don't have a lot of familiarity with stormwater regulations in Washington State. I do know that the jurisdiction of the law that really discourages the adding of impervious. They're claiming it prohibits them from adding impervious. I mean, there are mitigations that are used for increased impervious surface, and perhaps they don't have enough right away to do this, but natural drainage swales, bioswales that treat the runoff are, I believe, accepted practice in Washington State. So when you're adding impervious surfaces, you can mitigate those that impervious surface. Other than that, I mean, porous asphalt is another option. I'm not familiar with the use of porous asphalt in a shoulder condition, so I'm not sure if that is a solution. Yeah, I mean, other than, I think if there's a way to, usually there's a way to mitigate the impervious surface, but if there's just a condition where that's not possible, then not exactly sure what the counter argument to that would be.
I don't have much to add other than recognizing that this is an issue along the East Coast as well, and it's impacting the construction of shared use paths. There's going to be more paths that are being built with porous pavement, and like Michael, I'm just not familiar with the specifications and the proper design for shoulders that could be constructed in porous material. Probably not ready for that type of treatment yet, but it may come down to what other mitigation efforts or other mitigation treatments are in play, so that perhaps you can get the paved shoulders in because you're doing other things that will compensate for that paved shoulder treatment. Goes a little bit beyond maintenance.
All right. On a shared roadway, should inspectors report pavement defects located in travel lanes that might be hazardous to a bicyclist, as opposed to defects near the curb or edge of the pavement?
Certainly, and I think I touched on one of those defects, one of those hazards that's an issue to bicyclists, but might not be an issue to road authorities that are out there and are noticing things, or the motorists, and that's the longitudinal cracks or joints that are opening up. Especially if they're wider than a ½ an inch or a ¼ inch, they can easily catch a bicycle tire. No problem at all for a motor vehicle tire, but an issue for bicyclists on a skinny tired bike. So if there is a hazard or a problem with a surface that is part of a travel lane, I would say report that, just like you would report any problems that are occurring, any hazards that are occurring within a bicycle lane or a paved shoulder.
Okay, are there any suggested cost estimates for basic maintenance activities?
Oh, there are. I just I can't rattle those off right now. There are obviously there's a range throughout the country on what the costs are for sweeping, and we just don't have those costs in front of us right now.
Yeah, I got to say, with every jurisdiction that we work in, it's a different number, and I mean, there's per mile cost for sweeping, there's linear fee costs for pavement markings, and those all vary based on a number of factors. So hard to give you an answer.
Okay.
I'm even having a hard time thinking of one good source where you can go and get all of those. Usually your Department of Transportation might have some unit costs for different maintenance activities. They might have something on sweeping. That might be worth a contact with the Department of Transportation. But I don't know of one really good source, and perhaps one of the listeners does know of a good source where you can go and get not only the estimates, but maybe even estimates based on region of the U.S. or by state.
Okay. Next question. When adjusting sensitivity for signal detectors, is it a good idea for the technician to start with the highest sensitivity and tune it down until there's no adjacent lane detection? Or is it better to start at the lowest sensitivity and tune it up until the car is detected?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I can't say I know the answer to that either.
Okay, well, we'll move on then. Can you please discuss in more detail the problem of slippery vegetation?
Of what education?
Can you discuss in more detail the problem of slippery vegetation?
Oh, okay. So the example I gave during the presentation was just the leaves that had fallen, and when they get wet, they tend to be really slippery. And that was the reason why the leaves should be swept to the side. You know, other than vegetation that has fallen onto the surface of either a roadway or a shared use path, I think that is the extent of the problem with slippery vegetation. You know, vegetation, there's other problems, of course, with branches and bushes that are growing into the path that are a hazard, and also the issue with vegetation that that restricts the sight lines at corners or in curves. James, are you still there?
Oh, sorry. I'm going to read this next one a little bit slowly because it's a little bit long.
Okay.
Given a 6-foot width between the curb and a travel lane, which includes a 2-foot gutter, you have 2 options for creating a bike lane during a repaving project. You can, 1, mill and replace the pavement, leaving a 4-foot asphalt bike lane and 2-foot gutter next to it, or 2, pave over the gutter, leaving a 6-foot asphalt bike lane to the curb. With the first option, the gutter tends to accumulate debris over time and or gets bumpier. With the second option, a longitudinal joint exists in the asphalt that may open up. Which is the better way to balance bicycle comfort and maintenance concerns?
Well, as long as you got the 4 feet, I think either option is going to be okay. So which is better? Often it depends on where you are. If you pave over that joint, you're especially if you're in a warmer climate where you're not getting the frost and the heaving from frost, and you're not getting the winter elements, that fracture probably won't come through for quite some time. So you have a nice smooth transition. And the thing is that cyclists will not have to worry about shying away from that joint. So they probably won't move within 2 feet, and they shouldn't be moving within 2 feet of the vertical face curb. But on the other hand, they can utilize the entire 4 feet. So I think the preference in most environments is probably to pave across and over the gutter section. I don't know about the additional accumulation that occurs within that 6-foot swath of asphalt. It seems like the accumulation is going to occur whether you have a 6-foot paved section over the joint, or if you have a 4-foot paved section that abuts the joint, the gutter joint. Seems like you're going to have the same accumulation. In fact, it might even be a little bit easier for the street sweeper to clean up when you have a really smooth joint and you have perhaps one slope instead of 2 slopes. Although I think there might be some issues with having a dual pitch with either scenario.
All right, thank you. Can you recommend good examples of local maintenance plans for shared use paths?
I don't know if there's
on that one.
Yeah, I don't know if there are many plans out there. I think a lot of the stuff has just grows organically from a streets department or a bicycle and pedestrian program. And there may be reports that are written on the cost to, if you're considering a new policy that you'll end up maintaining shared use paths, there might be a report that speaks to the cost of the maintenance of shared use paths and what it will cost over X amount of time to maintain paths. But I don't know if there's many plans out there that address specifically maintenance of bikeways and what things need to be put in play.
I might just add that in a lot of cases, shared use paths in a lot of communities are maintained by parks departments, so that might be a good place to look for that information. I was just recalling a recent bike plan that we did for a community, and we were putting together sort of a cost calculator for them. And one of the things that was really important for them was to include the maintenance of shared use path facilities. And for them, that maintenance, periodic maintenance, included basically vegetation maintenance, and they built in those costs. It would be for maintaining vegetation twice a year along all new pathways and existing pathways. And then for the long term, they sort of built in a number of overlaying the facility, 15 to 20 year period. That was and I'm happy to share that community name if anybody wants to contact me.
Yeah, that's a good point, Michael. I think that if there are any plans, it's probably not a freestanding plan, but it's tied to a bicycle plan where maintenance is addressed and should be addressed as part of the objectives of a plan and as part of the implementation chapter of a plan, especially if the community is not maintaining bikeways currently, and the plan is recommending that they do. So you need to include the elements of or the components of a maintenance program. So yeah, I would say that your best source is probably bicycle plans that have been done for communities. I'm glad Michael has this example because I can't think of communities that have done an outstanding job of doing that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is it lawful to close streets to bicyclists that are open to other vehicles?
Well, I guess it depends on. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you're talking about in a like a work zone type situation, sure. If it's deemed as too hazardous of a environment for a bicyclist, it's I think within the jurisdiction's ability to I mean, prohibit is a strong word. I don't know if they're going to be out there enforcing it, but certainly discourage bicyclists from traveling within the work zone. And that certainly is that example that I pointed out here in Seattle where they're installing a streetcar tracks. They don't prohibit it, but they, with multiple signs everywhere, strongly discourage bicyclists from going through the work zone. Tom, what were you going to say?
Well, I guess it depends on what authority the jurisdiction has, and if any of this stuff is codified in in ordinances or state statutes. But if there's a significant safety hazard, I would imagine that in most places they would have the authority to do that. The trick is, I think this is where the question is coming from, is that if a certain vehicle class is allowed to use it, then why can't all vehicle classes use that? So I guess there would have to be something that would be outstanding, an outstanding reason why bicyclists as a specific class can't use a specific class of a vehicle can't use it, whereas another class of vehicles can use it. And there probably are situations where that occurs.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, going back to what I was talking about, in the MUTCD has a strong language on keeping roadways open and accessible for bicyclists through work zones. So I think the support in the MUTCD is certainly there.
And if there is a complete closure, I know that we had, when I was working at Wisconsin DOT, there is the interstate that goes across the St. Croix River It connects Wisconsin to the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area. Actually, it's part of the metro area. One bridge, and on the interstate bridge there was a shared use path, and the shared use path was closed when the bridge was being reconstructed, and what Wisconsin DOT and Minnesota DOT put in place was a shuttle service to make sure that bicyclists and pedestrians could still get across the river since their facility was being closed.
Okay, next question. Bike lanes in our area use flexible delineators to mark the edge of the bike lanes in some areas, but this creates conflicts with snowplows. Are there any recommendations for dealing with delineators in snowy regions?
One example I heard of recently, and it's not necessarily a new example, I think they've been doing it for years, the city of Montreal uses delineators on some of their, I guess what they would call bicycle boulevard type, or sort of boulevard cycle track type facilities, and they remove them in the winter time so that plows can plow the street.
Yeah, I don't know how you can get around that issue with actually moving.
I'm sorry, Tom, you're cutting in and out. Can you repeat that?
Sure. I don't know how you can get around it without removing the delineators. I think that there will be action to a point that they won't be able, you won't be able to use them again. So there, Michael reported, are ways to remove the delineators, and it might only be for a 3 or 4 month period. But that's probably the smartest way to deal with that issue.
Okay. Does the guide offer any ideas on designing to minimize maintenance problems, such as pavement damage from tree roots?
It does not. This is one area where the reader will have to use their own judgment. I think I have one example of the design of bicycle lanes by either not having a joint that separates the bike lane from the travel lane, or moving the joint to the left of the bike lane. When that joint starts to unravel, unraveling will occur also all it unravels. So that's one example of a design kind of feature that will reduce your maintenance costs, and maintenance in a number of maintenance reports that you get as well, or hazard reports that you get. But those are not identified in any one area in the AASHTO guide. So you can't go to a section of the AASHTO guide and start looking up what are the best techniques to avoid, techniques in design to avoid maintenance problems in the future.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Does the guide include any recommendations or suggestions on how to maintain shared use paths on bridges, or bridges on shared use paths, I'm sorry?
Well, the short answer is no. It doesn't provide any particular guidance on that issue.
James, so that question was the text on bridges, or as part of the shared use path.
I'm sorry, Tom, you cut out on us again. Could you repeat that answer?
Yeah, I was just asking you to repeat the question.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Does the AASHTO guide include any recommendations related to the maintenance of bridges on shared use paths?
Yes, I can model there really isn't dealing with either a shared use path that is well, there's a bridge that is part of the shared use path, or the shared use path is part of the bridge. There are perhaps special issues dealing with, especially long bridges. Where do you plow the snow? Where do you sweep things? Do you need to have some type of street sweeper? Often the inspection equipment for bridges on long bridges is either have to use the roadway and inspect underneath the bridge. Sometimes that inspection equipment is on the path itself and inspecting the bridge from the path. So there's a number of issues that factor into of the path. The guide is a very short section. It's only 7 pages. It doesn't break out maintenance on bridges themselves.
Okay. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for discussion. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question today. Once again, a PDF copy of the slide presentation will be available at www.bicyclinginfo.org/AASHTO later today, and a recording of today's program will be posted in a couple of weeks. Be sure to check our Facebook page at facebook.com/pedbike for updates on when that is posted. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. Again, we very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. Thank you again to our speakers, Tom Huber and Michael Hinz. And thank you to all of you for attending today's PBIC webinar.